welcome to Self-Society. We are on day number 6. This is the 6th projection of the U.S. presidential election. Mainly the contest between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And it is October the 21st, Monday, meaning we are only 16 or is it 15 days away from in-person election voting. Now on this channel, we are not using polling to make our projection or prediction about who is going to win the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Instead, we'll be using real voting data that has been put out by NBC News' website, along with past history voting trends, particularly going back to 2016 moving forward. So let's take a look at those two pieces of variable, and I'll let you know how we came up with the formula to determine which candidate is likely to get which state if all things continue as they are. So let's take a look at the first piece of data. Again, as I said, we're using NBC's News early voting website. And so far in the U.S., either by mail or early in-person votes, there have been over 14.4 million votes cast. And we can get each of the states' total votes cast by hovering over each one of the states. You can see also by clicking on that state, it breaks down what percentage were registered Democrat or which percentage was registered Republican or other. In our tabulation or projection, we will not using other or independent votes because we do not know how that splits toward Trump versus Harris. Instead, we'll simply be using the Democratic registration voting and the Republican registration voting up to now for that particular state. So we use that number and put it onto our spreadsheet. The other data we'll be using to determine who is likely to win are past voting trends, in particular for the years 2020 and 2022. You can see that in-person on election day voting was 27% of the total 100% of those voting in 2020 during the general election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. The remaining 73% either voted by mail, absentee, or in-person early. In 2022, that changed, where in-person during the midterm election, 43% voted on election day, and the remaining 56% voted by mail, absentee, or in-person early. Now, we are not necessarily going to be looking at 2020 as our baseline because of COVID. You can say that during 2022 there was some degree of COVID residual as well. So what data might we use? Let's take a third piece, a data set, and that is voting habits. Early voting drops while mail voting soars. If you take a look at this chart, share of electorate, going back to 1992, roughly 90% voted on election day. Every election thereafter, that's a presidential election that is, that dropped by roughly 5%, and that's been very consistent through time. So that by the time we had reached 2016, the contest between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, those voting on election day was roughly 60%. Now, of course, that really dropped quite precipitously in 2020 due to COVID. Only 28% actually showed up in person to vote on election day. So instead of looking at this, anomaly, we'll be looking at this trend line. And if we continue going downward, we can see that on a normal election, typically we would have expected about 50 to 52% showing up in 2020 if there had not been COVID to vote on election day in person. So we continue that trend downward, and we should be expecting roughly 45 to 50% to show up on Election Day in 2024. That means the remaining 45 to 50% will be voting early by absentee, mail-in, or in-person early. So that's the national average. However, state by state, that can vary quite a bit. And so I've taken this national average and I've applied it to the battleground states. And those states include Texas, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida. So you can see here in column B, here in the top left-hand corner, are percentages of those showing up early to vote, either by person or absentee or mail-in in that state for the year 2022. But I've tabulated that during midterm election, people do tend to vote by mail early, vote early, more so than they do during presidential elections. So I've tabulated an average. Dems, we're expecting that roughly 56% will show up early to vote, either in person, by mail, or absentee. For GOP, roughly 44%, making an average of about 50%, and independents, we're expecting about 50% to show up early. And on the same day, then, we'll be expecting the difference from 100 and that early vote. So in this case, for Dems, we would expect roughly 59.68, for example, in the state of Texas, to show up to vote. Whereas for GOP, it'll be higher, 68%, since less showed up in the early vote. We then divide the total that we get for Dems, in this case, or Dem, GOP, or independent, that show up during the election day voting, and we divide that by the early voting, and we get what's called a multiplier. In this case, each one of the parties get a multiplier. Dem gets a multiplier, GOP gets one, as well as the independent. Now, then we take that and multiply it by the total number of votes cast so far using our NBC News early vote website, and place it in column B here next to that state. And you can see then that early voting website also tells us what percentage voted from which party. For example, in the state of Georgia, with over 1.5 million votes mailed in and early voted, so far 46% of those have been Democrat, 49% GOP, and the remaining 5 other or independent. So that's what we're applying to our spreadsheet here. In the state of Georgia, we see 46%, 49%, and 5% respectively. And then we take that total, we'll then get, by multiplying this total vote by that percentage, we get the total number of votes, roughly. Then same day, we just do the opposite, where we subtract, we use our multiplier rather. We take this number here, for example, Dem early, and we go to the state of Georgia, and we apply our multiplier, 1.71. Dem's multiplier would be smaller than GOP's multiplier, since you can see in the state of Georgia, more show up early if they're Dem than do GOP, so we would expect the remaining for GOP to be higher as a percentage than we would from Dem. And then we add up the early vote along with the same day vote, and we get a total vote. And whoever has the most votes, of course, wins that state. Now, on the far right, you have independents, but we're not taking account, again, because we don't know which way that splits. But if we have a state that is hard or tied, we can maybe use that to determine who likely will win. Roughly 55 to 60% of independents typically lean toward Dems in the past 3 elections, and the remaining typically vote for Trump in the past 2 elections, that is. So, using all that data, let's go ahead and fill in our states. And before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and black this out so we don't get distracted. We can focus on the state. I'm going to be starting with the state that I believe Donald Trump most likely will win anyway, but I'm including because there's some rumor that Texas might go blue, though I think it's highly unlikely. And my model does show that is the case. So far, 133,000 plus votes have been cast in the state of Texas. And 50% of those have been Dem, and 43% of those have been GOP, which is a bit of a surprise, but that's a very small number. We're expecting probably well over 10 million votes for the state of Texas. The remaining 7% will be that have voted are under the category independent. After our multiplier, we get Dems with 165,000 plus votes, GOP with 181,000 votes, and independent 26,000 votes. So there's a difference of about 16,000 votes. It's unlikely that Kamala, if the election were held today, would be able to have some of those independent votes add up enough to get her over Trump's total. So it looks clear to me that at this time, Texas is going to Donald Trump. So far, we have 183 electoral votes for Trump and 232 for Kamala Harris. So let's go ahead and move over to our next state, and that is the state of Georgia. Excuse me. In the state of Georgia, thus far, there have been a total of nearly 1.6 million votes cast. Of those, 46% have come from Democrats, 49% from GOP. The remaining 5% independent. Now, it is still possible that Kamala Harris could pull out a win for Georgia if she gets enough of the independent vote. Although I think that's highly unlikely. She would have to receive 4% of the 5 to edge out Donald Trump. With the multiplier, clearly Donald Trump will have a lot more votes than is going to be possible for Kamala Harris to catch up at this point. If the election were held today, Donald Trump would receive 2.7 million votes, roughly, and Kamala Harris roughly 2 million votes. That means then Georgia, at this point, is going over to Donald Trump. So that brings our total electoral vote, 199 Trump, 232 Kamala Harris. So moving on to our next state, and that's the state of Arizona. And in the state of Arizona, so far, nearly 384,000 plus votes have been cast. 35% of those have been Dem, 44% have been GOP, 21% independent, early votes. Now, that's quite significant because the difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is roughly 9%. Independents make up 21%. So it's very possible Kamala Harris could win this state. But if we're just taking into account GOP and Dem strictly, with the multiplier, she'll end up with roughly 530,000 votes, whereas Trump will end up with 850,000 votes. So you can see Kamala Harris will have to nearly receive all of the independent votes for her to take the state of Arizona at this time. So that means Donald Trump will receive the 11 electoral votes at this time, bringing him to 210 versus Harris's 232. Moving on to our next state, and that's the state of North Carolina, we see so far there have been a total of little over 1 million votes cast. 36% of those have come from Democrats, 33% from GOP, and 31% from independent. So there's a slight lead by Dems, but with the multiplier, GOP will edge out with roughly 70,000 votes, with 1.190 million votes versus 1.02 million votes. So that's, again, a difference of about 70,000 votes. You can see under the independent, there are well over 900,000 votes. And again, remember that independents tend to slightly favor Dems over Republicans. That means that this state is essentially tied at this point. However, because of that, we're only accounting for GOP and Dem, I'm going to say Donald Trump will barely get the state of North Carolina if the election were held today and all things remain constant, bringing him to 226 versus Harris's 232. So let's go on. And we're moving on to the state of Nevada. So far, Nevada has cast 136,000 plus votes. 40% of them is coming from Dems, 35% from GOP, and 25% from independent. After the multiplier, we're expecting 135,000 plus for Harris versus nearly 151,000 for Donald Trump. That's a difference of about 16,000 votes. Now you can see under independent, there's about 95,000 votes that are anticipated in total. So again, Harris could catch up. If enough independents voted for Harris, she could surpass Trump. But at this time, again, only accounting for GOP versus Dem, Donald Trump takes the 6 electoral votes of Nevada, bringing them to a tie, 232 each. Now moving on to our next state, and that's the state of Wisconsin. And in the state of Wisconsin, so far, roughly 322,000 votes have been cast, 40% of those coming from Democrats, 19% coming from GOP, and 41%, the largest group of the three, from independents. So just that alone means the state is really unknown until we get the data on how that independent vote will split up. But giving our multiplier, accounting for GOP and Dem only, we're expecting Harris to receive 250,000 versus Trump's 151,000 votes. So that means that only accounting for Dem and GOP, Harris will take the state of Wisconsin using our formula, using our model. Oh, that brings her up to a total of 242 to Trump's 232. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move to the state of Florida. And I was using it as the last one because it's a state that was quite close yesterday, but some things have changed since. In the state of Florida, we've had 1.1 million plus votes cast. 42% of those have been Dems, 37% GOP, and that's in the state of Florida so far. 21% independent. Now, with our multiplier, Kamala Harris is receiving 1.3 million plus votes versus Trump's 1.467 million votes, meaning he's ahead by about 160,000 votes. You can see in the category of independent, there's been well over 700,000 votes cast. Given the slight advantage of independents toward Dems, it is possible for Harris to catch up, although unlikely. So, I'll be giving the state of Florida over to Donald Trump. Really no surprises at this point. So, 262 for Donald Trump versus Harris's 242. Donald Trump is only 8 electoral votes away from winning the White House. Now, the last couple states, we're going to go to the state of Michigan, because I believe that everything's going to come down to the state of Pennsylvania, probably, unless Trump can win Michigan. At this time, there's well over 1 million votes cast in Michigan. 54% of those have been from Dems, 36% have been from GOP, and the remaining 10% are independent. After the multiplier, Harris will receive roughly 250,000 more votes than Donald Trump. We're anticipating 1.579 versus Trump's 1.339 million. And the remaining 300,000 is enough, again, for Donald Trump, if he can pick up the roughly 60-70% of those votes, to at least tie or not surpass Kamala Harris in the state of Michigan. But as it stands today, only accounting for Dems and GOP, Kamala Harris is taking the state of Michigan. That means at this time, we have 257 for Harris and 269 for Donald Trump. So, as anticipated, it comes down to the state of Pennsylvania. And so far in Pennsylvania, there have been 921,000 votes cast. 64% have been for Kamala Harris, 27% for Donald Trump, 9% from independent. With our multiplier, Kamala Harris is expecting to receive almost 2 million more votes than Donald Trump, 3.9 million versus Trump 2.1 million, and 600,000 under the category of independent. Not enough for Donald Trump to win the state of Michigan, or rather Pennsylvania. However, keep in mind that these votes are mainly coming out of blue districts, and the red districts numbers have not been fully counted. So, we'll be getting new data coming in for the state of Pennsylvania when they have early voting, I believe tomorrow, or rather in-person voting tomorrow. And that may change things quite a bit, not only for the state of Michigan, but also each of the battleground states. So you'll want to stay with us to follow along the suspense to see how the states change, if at all, as we get closer and closer to Election Day. But as it stands today, October the 21st, Kamala Harris is receiving Pennsylvania's 19 electoral votes, making her the next president of the United States if all things continue as they are and her model is accurate, which I'm anticipating it's far more accurate than polling or pundits that are just sort of guessing. So, with that, if you like this particular model and you want to continue with this and be notified, hit that bell